people of relativism in positions of power. And as Putin becomes more and more distrusting of people he thought were competent, he puts people who are actually only less competent in power, but because they're related to him. So do you not think that that's just an inevitable direction that we're heading in?
When I was talking to him about this, he said that if you look at the nature of regimes over time, especially those with a ruler who's becoming older, it is not uncommon. One is that become more close-minded, more conservative, yes, less trusting, that's something else he said, but they also become just arrogant. I mean, he's been in power for a long time, and that hubris does eventually catch up to you. So I think something with the economy is a good example. The economic situation in Russia is pretty seriously bad, and that's something that's, I don't think a lot of people are doubting. If you just look at the data, it's dude, they have $100 billion of debt. That debt is growing so fast, and for Russia, that's a lot of money. But the way that they're taking care of that is like the worst case scenario possible. So printing money is bad.
This is The Global Gambit. How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to The Global Gambit, where we discuss very much the Russia-Ukraine war, the Russian economy, Putin's seeming desperation around Pokrovsk. That looks very fragile. But there is something else going on the interiors of the Putinist regime, something that, frankly, I wasn't that aware of until just a minute ago, because the news is that much changing that quickly. But someone who does know more about it and will be explaining it to me and all of us is Jason J. Smart, who we've had on the channel many times before, long-standing colleague and friend, and currently in Kiev. Jason, thank you for coming back on. I wanted to understand exactly what you have been hearing and what's going on now between Vladimir Putin and Sergey Lavrov.
So, I mean, Lavrov, who's never been a Kremlin insider, he's definitely on the outside. He's not a key decision maker, but still, he's on the outs. It seems that he would failed to prevent the sanctions that came on, and that's partially due to his relationship that was lackluster with Marco Rubio in their conversations. But it's also he's for a while been sort of out of things, and he is part of the National Security Council, and so he should be attending meetings, but he wasn't seen at the most recent one. It looks like he's also it's been decided he will sit out the G20, the other summit that they were going to with Putin. But what's interesting about it is, of course, Peskov, who's a spokesman for the Kremlin, said everything was fine, that there's nothing the matter. But at the same time, it does seem that there is something off about him. But as I said, what's key about him that's important to understand is that he is just a bureaucrat. He's the longest serving foreign minister in Russian history. At the same time, he doesn't make key decisions. For instance, the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, he wasn't aware of it, it looks like, until probably 2, 3, 4 hours before it happened. So he's not even considered to be very trusted. He's not given very sensitive roles and things. But more than that, if you look at like his own reasons why the regime doesn't trust him, look at his relationship with his daughter, look at where she grew up. Her Russian is very faulty. She spent most of her life in New York City. So her English is much better. They speak in English at home, which, by the way, is, of course, is nothing that would hold against you, by the way, Moscow, interesting enough. But it is something that simply just shows how he's sort of disconnected from everything else. Now, he himself is very corrupt as well. I mean, he's got tons of money. He does travel to all these different things with someone who's well recognized to be his lover for years and years and years. But he's got his own little plane over there doing his diplomacy stuff. But at the end of the day, today, it seems that he's been finally sidelined. But Russia is in a situation that we see people getting scapegoated for a lot of different things that are happening. We've seen the number of generals been arrested the last couple of years, not just after the Prigozhin episode, but the other ones. I mean, there's been 17 generals arrested in the past 3 years. By comparison, if you add up US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany, Britain, there's been 0 generals arrested in the past 3 years. But in Russia, there's been 17. What's also is interesting to see that they're fighting over resources more in things like the FSB. You look at the Sechin faction of the FSB, how it's dealing with the Bortnikov faction of it, see what's going on with Takachev. Look at these different changes, look at who's taking different positions. It's very hard to not argue that there's obviously a very serious problem at the FSB. It's very clear, it's very obvious. Just look at which ones have family members now taking major state enterprises. So I think it's very clear what's happening there. But either way, as the situation in Russia continues to worsen, there's a lot going on that today would be indicative of the fact that the Putin regime does not have a clear path forward. It doesn't know what to do. And that's why it's doing things such as, someone like Lavrov, the foreign minister, who doesn't actually make decisions. He's nobody. Why he's the one that in the end gets punished. They got in this situation up because of him. But now, because they can't get out of it, he's the one who's going to get punished.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been a long-standing feud, if you like, between the security services and the military. I think that was the whole disaster that led up to February 24th, right? Because of mismanagement and communication over who did what and how. during the first few days or hours even. But when it comes to Lavrov specifically, but his dependability, his effectiveness as a foreign delegate is second to none. This is not an endorsement of him as a person, but purely as a diplomat. He has been very effective, right? So why would he suddenly...
What do you think he's been effective at? Russia's the most sanctioned country in the history of the world. I won't say it's very effective.
He's been very effective at being able to ensure that Russia remains relevant outside of the West. I'm talking about that isn't just the West, Jason. Lavrov is.
I can't think of anything that he as foreign minister has done to advance that. I could say that the military has. I could say the FSB has. I can't think of anything the Russian foreign ministry has done that has really advanced that.
Well, okay. I disagree, but I think that it would be a mistake not to recognize that Lavrov is very good at being able to do quite a lot with not much, is what I'm saying. But
yeah, he's a smart guy. I mean, I'll give him that. He speaks, obviously, really excellent English. He speaks excellent French. He speaks the two national languages of Indonesia. And he speaks another language, I can't remember which one it was. It's one of the areas near India. And he speaks at the level of interpreter, which is pretty profound.
Precisely.
But sorry?
Precisely, and also the fact that he's been able to navigate the Russian Putin regime for as long as he has. When you said he's been an outsider, right? Clearly, Putin has seen some value in him for that.
The job. Keep on. His job is to do what? His job is to be the voice or the face of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But at the same time, what we see is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia has always been sort of a questionable thing. I mean, it's been said before that it might be 80% of it that is the foreign missions, who are people that are working for the SVR or they're working for the FSB, whatever it is, or one of the other state enterprises, but not actually doing diplomacy. I mean, not actual, just normal diplomats. His role, though, I don't think has ever been that significant. And the fact that he is not aware that they're about to invade Ukraine, that's pretty significant. I mean, that's something that you would definitely tell your foreign minister so you could try to prepare your allied countries for it so that they don't react badly. But they didn't. But once again, that's actually not his fault. That is the Kremlin's fault because they chose not to include him. But overall, if he's sidelined, I don't think that's going to change very much, frankly. I don't know who would come next, though. I'd have to look at that. I have no idea who would replace him. However, what we can say is that overall, it's within the senior leadership, we do see a lot of changes. I mean, the fact that today we see that Zolotov, who's the head of the National Guard, Rosguardia, back, September of this year, just a couple months ago, we see the incredible power he's just been giving, more powers. He's allowed to have tanks now in Moscow. That's sort of incredible. And that's due to the fact that they're having an ongoing conflict with the military. But the military itself is also having its internal conflicts that are pretty significant. I mean, and it's outside of just the arrest, which are ongoing. I mean, just last week, another general of Rosguardia got sentenced to 9 years in prison for corruption. But either way, the fact that they're going after so many people now is a pretty fascinating thing. And it's indicative of the fact of two things. I mean, on this very, very senior level, I think it's witch hunt. Hence why, Shoigu had to go, why Gerasimov, I think in the short term, will probably also go. It's because they failed in the objectives that they were given. The military has routinely failed. And I cite a stupid little example. Look at Kursk Oblast when it was occupied by Ukraine. Mm-hmm. They were given a deadline, and I don't remember the timeline, but it was like a month, I think, to get the Ukrainians out. Now, despite having a full month to do that, they weren't able to do it. So eventually, it went to 2 months, then it was 3 months. But in the end, what happened was that it was turned over to the FSB and other services to expel the Ukrainians, not the military, which is incredible that your Ministry of Defense, which in theory is defending your country, cannot defend the country one time it has to because it doesn't have the capacity. And has to rely on the FSB, the security service, to expel. And it just shows that there's serious conflicts within. But also there's a lot of, I think, role problems. It's not very clear whose role is what. And that's probably going to get further subdivided if we look at the rise of the private military companies that are owned by some of the wealthiest people in the country. But that's a different story. But yeah, it's a very interesting situation.
Could you see a repeat of the sort of effective privatization, the loan lender schemes of the 90s, basically? The state-owned enterprises at this rate?
Well, remember that back in 2024 was the court ruling in Russia that everything that was privatized in the 1990s, and I don't remember what the threshold was, but it was most things. Like Domodedovo Airport in Moscow was privatized. It's now owned by the government again. The total value of all the assets they've taken in the last year and a half is about $30 to $50 billion. So if we look at that money, I mean, the prosecutor general's office says it's about $29 billion. but outside estimates say it's about 50 billion. Now, what's interesting about all these different things, and they're very, very, very big companies, was that, it does follow this model that we saw with Yukos back with Khodorkovsky, but there's something else that's very interesting, is that if you look at the arrest of, and his name's going to skip my mind, one of the wealthiest people in Russia, owns the gold mines. Why'd they go for him recently? Why'd they just take all of his assets? Why are they going after these different companies? It's due to a lack of liquidity. They're trying to get money. Typically, these people have been scheming from the state, and these people are working for the FSB or the military. They were always setting up rackets within the state, that is to embezzle money that they're given to do their jobs. And they'd also, obviously shake down private companies. But today, the state simply doesn't have as much money, and it's much harder to steal this money. And so now they're going after these things that have been privatized. But to those same extent, when you look at the situation within this money that was taken, look at the major factions within the FSB and within the security structure of Russia, the Siloviki. So look at the ones. So if we have like Sechin, who's obviously the one that's tied to oil, the Black Sea Fleet, the Shadow Fleets, everything else that goes back to him, that's something that feeds his people. But today they're looking at this 30 to 50 billion bucks that is taken over by one of the other factions, the accountants, let's call them. Those are the guys with Kovalchuk. And we look at them, they've got all this money, and that's not something that makes the other faction very happy. And that's why today we see them vying for that. And that's why we saw that one of Sechin's people recently was put in charge of Department M. Department M is the one that's in charge of monitoring other offices and other government entities. Why that's important? Well, that's the one who is essentially a spy of the FSB and other offices. So now they've got their people in places like the prosecutor's office in order to monitor things like what happens to this money. Obviously, they're not interested in that for the interest of the national security. They're interested in that because they have their eyes on that money. And that's why historically we've been seeing who falls as a general or who falls as a minister, it's people tied to that. But if you want to get more specific to this, the more in depth, because you were saying that you weren't sure there's really conflict at the FSB, look at the example of Starlight, who was the Minister of Transport, who killed himself and got fired the same day. I mean, I don't think he killed himself, let's be clear. But look at him, what's most interesting is when people say, well, why did he get killed? Well, listen, he had been the governor of Belgorod, and about $256 million went missing that was meant for the defense of Belgorod. And shortly thereafter, the Ukraine invaded. That was a big no-no. But there's something else that's very important about that. Keep in mind, if you're someone like him, you're not able to physically go embezzle that money by yourself. You're working in collusion with others, like the Ministry of Defense, or in this case, probably the FSB. Now, why that gets really interesting really fast. Okay, so it makes sense. They're like, this guy, he's not going to be a minister anymore. If he gets fired, that means he can now be prosecuted, because in Russia, if you're a minister, you can't be prosecuted. But now he can be prosecuted, and that means he could talk, and then we're all going to be in trouble. So they have to off him. That's a very reasonable assumption. I mean, that makes sense to me too. But there's something that happened 2 weeks after he got killed that changed my mind about that. And that was simply the fact that 2 weeks or maybe 4 weeks after he died, the ports in Russia, all of them, were under the control of the Ministry of Transport. But they are no longer under control of the Ministry of Transport. They are under control of the FSB. Why is that? Well, guess who's in charge of the ghost fleets that are floating around the world? That's them. So that's their profit. But they also, when you are in charge of all the imports and exports, that means you can set up rackets. You know exactly what's coming in, what the value is, and also what's going out. But you're also the one and the only one directly in charge of that oil, these ghost fleets. And so as a result of this, it would appear to me at least that there's increasingly a fight for liquidity that is occurring. And that's typically what it is. It's about liquidity. I don't see anything ideological about it. I don't see evidence that it's anything more than that. But if you look at the different moves that we've seen recently, there's definitely signs that there is a fight going on about wealth.
It always comes back to, as they say, follow the money to a certain extent. I was not aware, to be fair, for viewers. Jason was explaining to me a little bit more because of how much things move quickly, but also in this age of AI and just unrelenting disinformation, it's very hard to believe what is a developing story with some genuine truth behind it to just collective storytelling, which has no basis at all in reality. As I've seen in the mainstream media as well, Western media is even picking it up. And as you've rightly pointed out, there's this growing rupture now with Lavrov, but also within the military versus FSB, which we've seen time and again, to be honest, Jason. I think we can look back to 2023, Wagner and all that, and the shake-up that Putin made towards some of the other senior members of the MOD or Shoigu, that sort of thing. So what makes this one different? Why is this situation more important than the other cases?
Well, there are different reasons. I mean, fundamentally why it occurred was different. I mean, the case of Shoigu, um, and his assistant, his deputy Ivanov, who got 13 years in prison. Now he's volunteered to go join the SVO, the Special Military Operation, to get out of prison. But either way, his deputy went to prison because obviously Shoigu's too senior. They would never send him to prison. It would look bad. It would look very bad. But now he has to show up to meetings wearing civilian clothing. He doesn't wear military outfits anymore. But Gerasimov's also not been seen a lot. Like, just look at the recent photos of Vladimir Putin at different events. You're seeing a lot less Gerasimov, and that's very noticeable. But either way, going back to your question, I think that the big difference is this, is that back then there was an immediate failure. So let's look at this. March 15th, I want to say it was in 2022, we did see a number of senior people get sacked or fired who were related to the intelligence services. That's usually assumed to have been due to the fact that there was such failures with the initial invasion of Ukraine. I mean, the fact that it clearly was not working out as they'd been promised. They had given faulty intelligence to senior leadership. They had said that this would go easily. They'd paid off everybody. This would not be, what it's become now, 3.5 years. Obviously, that was not anticipated by the Kremlin. So we saw a bunch of people get sacked. Now, you go forward a little bit. We saw a number of people, I want to say is 19 of them, but within 2 months or so of the Prigozhin incident, we saw about 19 of them in military. I don't think there was any intelligence, if I recall, but they're all in the military who did get sacked as well, or moved out, or disappeared. But what we see now is different. Is that that's a top-down decision. So those two things were the result or the fruit of actual formal investigations. It would appear because it was so systemic and it was so quick and so many of them at the same time. But this, it's much more personal in nature. I mean, we know that there's a major conflict. There's always been between Bortnikov, for instance, who's the head of the FSB, with Zolotov, we'll use him, Rosgvardia, National Guard. And that conflict is over a lot of different things. And as you know, Rosgvardia, I think the presidential decree was 2016 that allowed them to absorb Sabor and let's call it the riot police in Russia and the SWAT teams in Russia. That was absorbed by his people. But that's something that the FSB doesn't really like because that means that they have less power domestically. But the fact that recently, I think it was quite literally September 2025 as well, the same date, was when Rosgvardia was finally given its long-time desire to allow to keep tanks in Moscow. So why is that? Well, we don't know exactly, but that is something that you normally would not keep in your capital because that's for armor-on-armor conflict. That's not for putting down riots. So why do they want to have them in the city? The Rosgvardia, not the military, the Rosgvardia. It's because they're directly loyal to Putin. Look at Zolotov himself. He was the bodyguard of Putin. They're close as personal friends. But Putin has always tried to balance these different groups. For instance, if you look at Patrushev, who was the head of the National Security Council, his son, Dima, was the Minister of Agriculture. Now it's Dima's partner, girlfriend, who's the head of Ministry of Agriculture. But he himself is Deputy Prime Minister now. Now, if you look at him or his family, Patrushev, that is actually close to Putin. They've been friends since the early 1970s, or at least mid-1970s. They both served in the KGB. And Dima, the son, who a lot of people used to say was probably going to become the next leader of Russia after Putin. Now look at his case. He has literally known Putin since he was a child. Like since he was born, he has known Putin. So that would make a lot of sense. Not everybody can have that sort of close relationship. But Putin trusts people like that. And that's why you look at the Rottenbergs or the other people who become extremely wealthy during the Putin regime. It's because they've known him since like childhood. But Putin doesn't, like any person, how many friends do you still have that you had when you're a child? So he doesn't have a ton of guys like that. So he has other people he's picked up along the way who he does trust or he has faith in. Shoigu was one of those people, by the way. It seemed that they did have a personal relationship. But today, he's been disappointed by these people time and time again. And that's why he's appointed so many of his relatives. I think it's 29 relatives of Putin hold senior jobs in Russia. Not senior, they're not ministers, but like deputy minister level. There's a lot of them who are from Putin's family. It's directly blood relatives. So when you look at this, it seems that he doesn't trust his own people as much, and now he's going to rely more and more on his own. If you look 15 years ago, he had no relatives in the government. So what's changed? Why is it the people that were once close to him, who he had so much faith in, he no longer feels that way? But it's quite clear. Yeah, sorry?
No, I just to expand on that with a sort of a question on it, because isn't that just a reflection of despots, though? You can look at history where people, as they age, paranoia sets in, they become more insecure and less trusting. We don't even have to look at recent history. It's, ancient history. We can look at how they begin to close in and only really family members. I mean, Napoleon did it, didn't he? And that only got worse. I mean, he wasn't as old as Putin, but he put people of relativism in positions of power. And as Putin becomes more and more distrusting of people he thought were competent, he puts people who are actually only less competent in power, but because they're related to him. So do you not think that that's just an inevitable direction that we're heading in? Aside from obviously the war.
It's not uncommon. I mean, listen, there's a guy, a political psychologist from St. Petersburg, who's been living in the U.S. for 30 years, who I talked to just 2 days ago about this. And he's written books about Russian politics. Actually, I co-authored a chapter with him back in 2004 about Russian politics. But either way, what's interesting about this guy, a political who's PhD is in this. He went to St. Petersburg State University, which is where Putin went to school. By the way, also where Vladimir Lenin went to school. But neither here nor there. And where Medvedev was a professor. But neither here nor there. What I was going to say is that when I was talking to him about this, he said that if you look at the nature of regimes over time, especially those with a ruler who's becoming older, it is not uncommon. One is that become more closed-minded, more conservative. Yes, less trusting. That's something else he said. But they also become just arrogant. I mean, he's been in power for a long time. And that hubris does eventually catch up to you. So I think something with the economy is a good example. The economic situation in Russia is pretty seriously bad. And that's something that's, I don't think a lot of people are doubting. If you just look at the data, it's dude, they have $100 billion of debt. That debt is growing so fast. And for Russia, that's a lot of money. But the way that they're taking care of that is like the worst case scenario possible. So printing money is bad. Let's agree that that's like a great way to create inflation. But what they're doing is even worse is that they're taking the money out from the banks. But by taking the money out of the banks, they've left the banks with a lot less liquidity than they used to have. And that's why we see these repo auctions by the central bank, where they're giving liquidity to the banks in short term for like a short, very, very short periods of time, in order to make sure that they don't have bank runs. So they're able to satisfy day-to-day transactions. The fact that they've put so many more limits on how much money you can take, I think it's $150 a day is max that you can withdraw, and any bank can decline to let you take out your money for the foreseeable future. They don't have to ever give it back to you. Now, the way that they phrase it, of course, is that, for your own security and your interest, so that you're never like forced to take out money by somebody who's trying to con you. We'll make the decision for you if you get to keep your money. But it's obvious, and it's a liquidity problem. But the banks don't reflect that on their balance sheets, which creates another problem. Nobody really understands what is happening, but we can guess how much is coming out because we can look at other outputs and we can try to determine what it's close to. But today, there's obviously some very significant problems in the banking sector in Russia. And in fact, there's a Kremlin think tank, whose name I can't recall. They came out with a report probably 2 months ago. Oh gosh, I can't remember the name though. But what's fascinating about it is, it's very, 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 very in-depth, much deeper into finance and banking than I can be. But I do have friends that are into finance and banking who speak Russian well, who I asked to read it for me to summarize it. And they gave me the key passages to read. Literally, the almost verbatim words used were something effective. If this continues for another 18 months, we could anticipate cascading bank failures within Russia. And that's not a joke. The fact that something tied to the Kremlin says that and publishes it, it's on their website. I went to their website and downloaded it. That's why I know it exists. The fact that they say that is probably very significant.
Why hasn't Russia's economy collapsed yet if it is still so bad?
I don't know why. Everyone always asks that. But the reality is, if you go to a doctor and they tell you have stage 4 cancer and you're going to die, they're not giving you the date. They're telling you you're terminal. And the patient in this case is terminal. It will die. It's not, I don't know what date it's going to happen, but I can guarantee you it will. It's not sustainable as it is. If you go and they do a blood test and they tell you you're terminal and you have stage 4, it's probably true. I don't think they're just kidding. And when you look at the economic indicators from Russia, it's the same. It's not going to survive.